Greetings. Welcome. This is Brains, Minds, and Consciousness, COG 266. This is a course close to my heart. It is about the interconnected nature of these three somewhat distinct, but also somewhat heavily overlapping concepts. And they are right at the heart of cognitive science. I am John Linstead, professor of cognitive science here, and also your guide on a hike through a variety of pretty interesting ideas. So let's get started. So let me start with a question that I have both begun and ended the intro cognitive science course with. What are you? It's a challenging question. You might chew on it. If you took my previous course, you may have a pretty robust answer to it. But there's a lot of ways to tackle this question. Here are a few answers you might throw out there. Easily, a person. Okay, that's fair enough. It's a little bit boring, not very in-depth. We're not getting at anything more complex than, hey, I'm just one of those people things, right? Here's a fun one I got in class once. A brain riding a meat machine. Well, that's kind of fair. This encapsulates the idea that you are in your brain and you are sort of pulling all the levers to move your body around and make mouth sounds like I am doing now. Here's a pretty standard one from my other courses. An interconnected bundle of tissues and neurons. That's a little bit more in-depth. It opens the door to a lot of questions about what are these bundles? How are they connected? What do neurons do? Here's another standard answer from my classic cognitive science perspective. An especially advanced physical symbol system. Ah, interesting. So now we're touching on what this system is capable of even doing. What am I doing to produce these words? How am I transforming information to make words come out of my mouth? How am I taking that information in? What are the properties of how I move symbolic information around? Another one, a complex intelligent agent. Okay. This touches on the ideas of I am capable of intelligent thought. Oh, what is that? That is the idea of not just brute force search, but actually choosing things that might get me to a better state, right? And an agent capable of perceiving the world and acting on it. All right. What about a big wet computer? That's an interesting one. That's still in the same zone. It's sort of taking the idea of being a symbolic processor and flipping it on its head because, wow, we're just a big old bundle of wires, huh? It's a little bleak in a way. Yeah. A lot of different ways to look at this, and this is just the beginning, right? This is a million billion ways you could formulate an answer to that question. And so that's kind of what this course, where this course begins. We are diving down into all the specifics. We're kind of breaking this big, broad question apart into how exactly does all this stuff fit together? And so that's where we get to the 3 units of this course. Unit 1 will be brain, Unit 2 will be mind, and Unit 3 will be consciousness. So let's ask some more questions that might guide us toward these different units, right? So instead of just, what are you? How about, what is a brain? Well, it's definitely that thing inside your head, right? And we at least know that, knock, knock. But what is it composed of? What's going on in a brain? How does it function? What's its whole deal, right? So that's what Unit 1 is all about. Brain. So this will be a deep dive into the nature of, really importantly, neurons. How they evolved, what their properties are as a biological cell, the varieties that exist, how they come together to build networks of information transmitting biological cells. We'll spend the most time here because it's the best understood piece of the three different units we're talking about here, right? Turns out being able to directly observe something, say with not just cracking the head open, but also being able to scan it with different technologies, it's pretty great for understanding more precisely what the thing is and how it works, right? So, as a warning, this content will be detail-rich, like very, very. We were going to go very in depth, right? But this is not a neurobiology course, so more what's going to happen is we'll touch on deep details of how different pieces of cells work in neurons and things like that, but only really long enough so you can get a picture of their role and how they fit together to, form something as complex as a brain. So, we will be talking about biology. No, you will not be beholden to memorize every single cell piece and all that. It'll be more about, hey, look at this crazy property of how the cell walls work, and that means this for how a neuron works, which means this for how a neural population works, etc. Don't sweat it. It's a walk, right? We're climbing. We're gradually walking up to the peak of this mountain. We're not boulder climbing. So let's just scoot along with a little intro to these concepts, though. So brains, right? Brains again. Brains are a physical structure that support the control of behavior in biological systems, right? So brains are inherently this biological thing, right? We wouldn't call a computer's processors and all of its pieces brains, not really. Not that they can't do things like brains, but brains, typically what we're talking about is this miraculous organ that computes information. It's amazing. So brains belong to not just us, right? There's tons of animals and creatures in nature that have brains. They vary in their size, in their complexity, and in their structure. So we'll talk mostly about human brains, but we can also talk about other brains. For example, here's a slug. A slug has about 1,000 neurons. Really not that much when you think about the number of different connections. But a slug still can move around. It can still do its jobs in the world. It can detect food, crawl onto things. It probably can't do math. That's okay for a slug, right? What about bees? So bees, they increase this complexity quite a bit. If you think about a bee, it doesn't just kind of slob around and climb onto leaves and chew them up and then go on with its day. They do a lot more complex stuff, right? They need a lot more information transmission. They're able to do their bee dances and communicate bee stuff to other bees. They're able to find paths towards the best flowers. They're able to detect things that, in flight patterns and such. They're able to cooperate in various ways, build complex structures. Okay, so a bee, they've got 1 million neurons. And between them, about 1 billion connections. You might not have thought of a bee as particularly complex, but it's several orders of magnitude more complex than a slug. We kind of think of them both as bugs, right? Oh, there's just this thing, this mollusk out there, and this insect. Oh, get away from me. It might sting me, right? But they're pretty complicated. Now, are they as complicated as we are? No way. Meet Guy. This guy has a brain, just like you. How many? How many brain does this guy have? This guy has 10 to the 10 brain. This brain has 10 billion neurons, and it has about hundreds of trillion or maybe a quadrillion connections between them. Hey, we're just getting into weird numbers now. Like you don't even really we don't grasp what the difference between a billion, a trillion, and a quadrillion are, but holy crap, that's a lot. That's more than there are stars in the known universe. Your brain is incredibly complex. You're a lot more complex than a bee, and you're a lot more complex than a slug. And this is kind of the nature of brain. This is why brain is so interesting. We live on this continuum of complexity and the things that we're capable of. So perhaps a slug doesn't really interact that well with it doesn't really matter about other slugs and other things. It just kind of moves around and does its job to survive a little while. Bees have all these social structures and physical structures. And then humans can do things like build computers and talk about how complex they are to other humans over the internet, which we also built. So that's the idea of brains, right? They are complex physical, biological structures. So another thing that we can think about in terms of brains is how are we actually thinking, like in terms of what questions are we asking about a brain? How we approach studying a brain depends on the kinds of behaviors we're actually trying to explain. So this is where a pretty important concept of levels of analysis comes in. So different levels of analysis will describe different functions in any system, not just brains, in anything, right? But let's look at the different levels of analysis we could ask about brains. We have the chemical level, right? We all are aware that there's lots of chemicals that you can take to alter the way your brain works. Some are more fun than others, and some are pretty important to survival. And that's just a feature, right? You provide extra chemicals, the neurons will do all kinds of stuff with those chemicals. Which chemicals are important? What do they do? How does the fact that we add things to the system change the way that the system processes chemicals? Kicking it up a layer, neurological, right? How do neurons function? What are the kinds of neurons? What are the different ways that neurons fit together and move information around? What happens if some of these neurons die? What happens if they are overly connected and they're not actually, they perhaps cause things like seizures? Understanding the function and properties of neurons are other questions, allow us to ask other questions about the whole system. What about the functional level? So things like, does this brain region function properly? If this particular region is damaged, what does that change? The brain regions all have different things that they do. So how do they impact each other? If they are functional or overactive or stimulated or not stimulated, how does the activation of one affect another? That's sort of another middle layer. So it's above neurons and it's far above chemical, but they're all still connected, right? They live on top of each other. They overlap. And then you get up to the sort of the whole brain, right? The whole brain function, right? So how does the entire unit work, right? What's the psychology of the entire brain? What's the personality that comes out of the entire brain? What is this entire brain's history, right? All dependent on the functions and the neurons and the chemicals. So this is sort of the chart of how we're going to move around. So that's the big idea of how we're going to look at the brain through various lenses, different levels, from chemical to neuron to functional regions to whole brain regions to the entire universe, whatever, right? From top to bottom, bottom to top. So the different levels of analysis help to explain the different types of brain function and the ways that they all interact together. It also helps to better explain certain kinds of observed behavior. So certain behaviors and behavioral problems and whatever we call the disorders and such, some can be explained at the neurological level. Different, there's a malfunction of some neurons populations. Maybe it's more about an imbalance in your chemicals, right? Depression and anxiety can often be attributed to these things. So that's the idea. These are the questions we'll ask as we begin to drill into, no sad, scary pun intended, drill into brains, right? So now we can ask some other questions. What is a mind? Well, shoot. Is it me? Is it a thing I am? Sort of. It's a thing I have, maybe? What is a mind? If it's not just a brain, what's the difference? How does a mind manifest, right? Maybe we should ask these questions. Unit 2 gets into mind. So these will be tons of questions on the fundamental nature of the mind, the functional moving parts. So what are the actual, abilities of a mind? A mind can look at things and attend to things and process things and all these important things. Of course, it's using the brain, but the question is, at this higher level, remember, levels of analysis, at the whole brain and above, what is the functional role of mind? And also, what are its capabilities and its limitations? Some have called the mind the ghost in the machine, and that's a pretty interesting take. It's sort of the thing that is intangible, but definitely is attached to the physical. Yeah, it gets a little trippy in this class. So, what we'll discuss in this section is a variety of different sort of interconnected philosophies of mind, what a mind is, what is the nature of mind. We'll talk about various cognitive capabilities and functions of the mind, things like attention, perception, motor activation even, we would call that, right? All tied to the nature and the neurons under the hood, right? So we're not just leaving brain behind. We're saying, what can brain, given what we know about brain, what can we explore about mind? So, more on minds. More on minds. No. Minds. So, minds are constructed of a variety of cognitive capabilities. That's at least one way we can think of it. My mind is a different beast than the mind of a slug because I have a lot more stuff going on, honestly. I can carry out higher level logic. I can perceive the world. I can memorize things about the world. I have a pretty rich memory. I don't know if a slug has a very rich memory. I can remember things about my mom when when I was 10 years old, whereas a slug, I don't know, probably doesn't need to, right? And decision-making, attention, thought, all these wonderful things that are properties of how a mind works, right? And yeah, that's not fully satisfactory, right? Mind is a sort of a slippery concept. It's more difficult to explain and explicitly define than the brain because it's more intangible. It's harder to observe the mind. We all kind of know in this concept that, yeah, we all have minds and they work a certain way, but it's hard to point to it. Where is it, right? Some popular cognitive science theories like to sort of use this. I think it's an apt analogy, but not necessarily an perfectly accurate one. Mind is the software that runs on the brain's hardware. The physical symbol system hypothesis, if you think back to COG 166, if you had it. Don't worry if you hadn't, no worries. But that's a connection, right? Thinking about the system, the program, the set of rules that run on the hardware. So, for example, on your phone, the brain is the thing itself, the phone, the physical object, the stuff it can do, the processors it has, the memory banks it has, even the power, how do we get food into the brain? How do we get electricity into the phone? That's all the brain. That's all the stuff, the hardware. The mind is more like the operating system and the various apps that exist, right? So you have different functional roles the mind can take on. And these different functions, they kind of turn the hardware into a different thing, right? Your phone can be a flashlight. Your phone can be a text messenger. Your phone can be a phone. Fancy that. Oh my gosh. Your phone can be a clock. Your phone can be a calendar. Your phone can be a photography center. Your phone can be a text editor. You know, I think I've reached I've made it clear. But that's pretty powerful, because the mind, the operating system, the system that runs on the hardware, is capable of a lot of things. But there's still a philosophical question, because we still got to address that core question of, well, but still, what is it? What's its nature? So sure, we'll talk about these functional roles, but the other questions are things like, is the mind physical? I mean, think about the analog. Is software physical? Yeah, I guess, in a sense. It's you might download a video game, right? And that video game is a pattern of information stored on a disk, right? In a solid state drive, perhaps. How physical is that? You know? It's just electrons changing very, very, very small bits and bytes, ones and zeros, that are then read later. Ooh, I mean, it's physical. But where is it? Well, I can point to the exact locations on that physical piece of hardware, but, it's hard to wrap it up in a neat, nice bow. Is it this different kind of stuff? Are we going beyond the physical now? And no, this is not just a meandering, psychotropic rant. This is a real question that philosophers have tackled over the centuries. There's lots of ways to think about. Is there a mental stuff to the world? Or is it all physical? And how might they interact if they both exist? And it's tricky. So, some think of minds as the software and the brains as the hardware. But there's a lot of competing theories. It's not always clear. And we'll explore a lot of these ideas. And different disciplines will approach the mind in different ways. You know, biologists might have a more pragmatic neural response concept of a mind. They don't even really have to address it, right? A philosopher might have a deeper existential treatment of the mind. A psychologist might sit somewhere between those two. And every field has its own variations within of what they consider necessary to define about a mind. So, I hope I've painted the picture that we know some stuff. We know some interesting things about mind. But there's a lot of gray areas. And it's a fun space to explore. So, now, here's the hard one. The hardest one. What is consciousness? Okay, if you take this one at its face value, it is the property of being conscious. Haha. Webster's dictionary wins again. Okay, what is conscious? Well, it's at least awake. Right? It's at least active, perhaps. But it's hard to pin this one down. It's slippery. It's the question of, what is it to be awake? What is it to be able to be? What is it to be conscious? Awake, perceiving the world, active. You have a rich internal life, maybe? How can I be sure? Oof. So, before tripping too far, we'll also tackle these questions. And there's a lot of interesting work in this domain. It's a lot more philosophical, so it's less hard scientific stuff that's been pinned down and proven with rigorous research, and more sort of taking these questions to their extreme and seeing, well, what would be possible if they were this or that or the other. So, questions on the nature of the lived experience of being conscious. So these are the most open-ended questions we'll get to in the course. We'll discuss a variety of philosophical angles for examining these hard questions, more so than empirically grounded scientific theories, right? So, consciousness. We'll take a little trip right now. It's this philosophical concept, primarily, with a variety of meanings. So, one good I hesitate to say definition, because I don't want you to think that these are hard and fast, right? These are sort of working definitions, operational definitions. The subjective character of experience. Oof. Let's unpack that. Subjective, so not objective, but the subjective, the experience of the individual, the character, the qualities of that, and the experience of being alive. For example, consider a bat. What is it like to be a bat? Well, we can think about, what its various features are. Oh, it has wings so it can fly. That's kind of neat. It has particular echolocation abilities, all this good stuff. But it's not just perceiving like a bat. It's not just behaving like a bat. It's about the experience the bat has of the world, day to day, moment to moment, heartbeat to heartbeat, right? You have your version of how the world works and is and how you perceive it and what you think of it. And a bat has a completely different one. It has a different lived experience. And the question is, can we access the subjective character of this bat's lived experience? The answer is no, right off the bat, because... right off the bat, sorry. The answer is no, because no one is a bat. And we don't know any bats that know enough language to communicate this to us, right? But that's the fundamental thing. That's what makes consciousness such a tricky question. Because this is hard to grasp. This is hard to pin down. It's even harder than the mind to point to and say that there is the mind. That's hard enough. This is even harder. What is consciousness? Where is consciousness? How is consciousness? So, cognitive science has ways to answer those questions in objective ways, in terms of objective definitions of, okay, this is a conscious thing, it is awake, etc. But that doesn't mean this is a solved question philosophically, right? As we saw in the mind question, different groups will have different ways of characterizing this question, just so they can get by. Consciousness is kind of an ultimate question. So philosophers, some argue that it's actually impossible to understand subjective experiences because of what I said about the bat, right? We are not bound to the biology and the neurology and the lifespan of a bat. We don't know what its life is like lived. We can write them down. A bat lives 10 years. I don't know if that's true. Don't at me on that. A bat has pointy ears. Cool, I can sort of picture that. But we don't get it all at once. We don't get the combination. And the idea is we simply cannot know to a satisfactory extent what it's like to be a bat. Another way you might have come across this question is in the idea of color perception. Now, set aside the idea of being colorblind or not, right? This is one of the first questions first deep philosophical questions a lot of children hit upon sometime between 8 years old and 16 years old or so. Not to say if you didn't hit upon it, you're somehow not philosophical. It's more that it's one of these that people routinely rediscover on their own. And that is, a tree exists in the world. Sure. Okay, there is a tree. You got me, and you got you. I look at this tree, and I see the color green to my eyeballs, right? But what if when you look at this tree, my green, we might both agree this tree is green, but what if what you're actually seeing is my red? What if I inhabited your brain for 10 seconds, I saw a wild rainbow of color that was nothing like what I experienced in my own head? And then I jump back into my own head and I see the normal green again. Does it matter? We both know that that color is named green, but perhaps inside of our own brain's sort of, processing of the visual stimuli, you're actually getting red and I'm getting green. Now, to fold the colorblind back into this, that kind of is the experience of being colorblind. You say, yeah, I don't see the same way you do, right? But at least they can tell. So this one's hard. I hope some of you are sort of nodding along and some of you are sort of like, oh, interesting. And I know some of you are like, what the hell is he talking about? That's okay. These are slippery questions and they won't always take root. Don't sweat it. But that's the idea. These are the ideas of how this is a sort of a Wild West territory of the concepts of consciousness. So, that is all to say, individuals' experience of color, the way they internally see it, might be different. But if I asked them each, hey, what color is that tree? They would both say green. Even though this one looks pretty brown. Another thing here is there's a lot of open questions when we talk about consciousness. And there's a lot of thought on these open questions going way back thousands of years, right? We are not the first to think about these questions, and it should tell you something that they are still open questions. Let's push a few through. So, what constitutes the self? What is the self? What is the self? Is it my body? Is that myself? Is it my brain? Is it my pineal gland? Is it a very kind of ethereal mind thing that lives above and beyond? What is the self? What is identity? What is it to be the same thing extended in time? We'll talk about Theseus' ship. If you want to get a little preview of that, you can go ahead and Google it. It's an interesting one of these thought experiments, right, that we see so often in philosophy. Another open question. Do we expect an artificial entity will ever become conscious? For that matter, how do we know anyone else in the world actually is conscious? Are they just zombies, moving around and doing their day-to-day thing, but never having an internal experience at all? Probably not. I can tell you right now. But maybe. How do I prove that? Or disprove that? That's a hard question. Because consciousness is so hard to point to and to pin down. For that matter, how do we know anything that we perceive in front of us is real? This is the Descartes question. Oh man, I know that my eyes are kind of crummy. What if all of it is crummy? What if all of it is lies somehow? What if it's all hallucinogenics, right? But that's not necessarily the case. But can I prove it? These are the philosophical questions that guide the latter part of this course. So, that's brains, minds, and consciousness. The whole kind of roadmap, right? All three of these concepts are real close to the heart of cognitive science. And that's sort of the bulk of what we'll talk about. But another sort of thing that you might want to be aware of while we walk our way in is that there's a lot of different approaches that cut across these three questions in different ways. Cognitive science is an interdisciplinary field, right? As one ought to know coming into it. It takes questions and techniques from various places, various different other fields that are connected, and try to use them to triangulate answers to some of these difficult questions by looking at them through different lenses. So these lenses, we won't be covering them in too much depth, but I just wanted to sort of prime you with the idea that there's a variety of approaches. So cognitive science itself, right? It is a broad and complex field. It draws from a lot of different other fields, and it's all arranged, situated around these questions because they are so difficult, right? That's why an entire field was born to tackle these questions. There's many perspectives and approaches. There's a lot of different ways to assess any given phenomenon associated with a brain, a mind, or with consciousness itself. So let's talk about some of these approaches and just give a little quick primer on each one. Here's a classic: the computational representational approach, which is more or less the most dominant in the field at present. And it's the one that's most often encountered outside of cognitive science itself. Sometimes it's referred to as the box and arrow style because it's all about programmatic, computational nature of the models of the way information flows through different parts of the brain, right? Information come in the front, it gets moved around and changed. We might hear language and parse it out and turn it into instructions that we can feed to our hands and feet and such, right? If I tell you to flip a coin, you'd have to process that information, see that it was a command, and go and make use of that, your limbs, to say, let me go find a quarter, right? Or to ask me why, right? So this is the idea of understanding that the world is mediated by these representations, these small mental copies of pieces of the external world. And that this is the idea that those are what form the basis of thoughts and cognition, different little representations moving around. It's sometimes biologically inspired, but typically it's more attached to sort of mathematical relationships and computational, programmatic, computer-like ways of thinking about minds and brains and what they do. Then there's the more neurophysiological approaches, right? These approaches will explain behavior and cognitive phenomena using biological mechanisms of brains and neurons. So very biologically inspired, but reduced in form so that you can make predictive models. These make great use of brain imaging techniques, and they're always improving. Between these two, so at the strictly analyzing the neurobiological stuff, even in large, aggregate ways like this, and the sort of floaty, symbolic, abstract stuff, is the connectionists approach, where it's saying somewhere between the neurobio and the computational representational stuff is the focus on, okay, if neurons are the ways that we're doing things, let's try to just simulate some neurons and see what we can do with those properties in the computational world. So not box and arrows, but more connected nodes in these mass distributed networks. You're probably already seeing, there's all kinds of crazy machine learning stuff going on in the world these days. And a lot of people think this is the future of artificial intelligence, but there's some issues with that too. There's a lot of black boxing going on where it's like, oh, I'll train the network and let it do this thing. And then we ask, what is it doing inside the network? And they say, I have no idea, right? So there's a lot of variety in this field, and it's determined by the techniques that are employed. So this is sort of the overlap of the previous two ideas. Now, kind of stepping to the side of that little totem, those three kind of connected approaches, situated cognition approaches. These are approaches that say, stop with all the representation stuff. We don't need to focus on representation as a core tenet of what brains do and what brains and minds are doing. It's more about the interaction between your physical body, the environment, and sometimes even the tasks that you're doing, right? So you have a brain and you use it to process things about the environment. There may be representations going on, but we don't need to focus on that, I think is the best way to put this. So these are different names for different little flavors of this kind of approach. Extended cognition, where you might have cognitive tools in the world that you might consider part of your cognitive approach. There's embodied cognition, where the properties of your hands are also maybe properties of the whole system, right? And ecological, where you are really, really emphasizing the dynamics of the environment and the world outside of you and how that constrains the way your system works, right? These approaches are going to ask very different theoretical questions, and they're focusing on the processes of perception and your action in the world. Then there are Bayesian approaches. So these are attempts to explain cognition as the result of a very powerful single inferential algorithm, sort of a statistical approach, Bayes' theorem, meaning that we start with some prior knowledge. The world gives our neurons, our system feedback, and we update that knowledge with posterior knowledge. So now we have an outcome. This is sort of how they're suggesting learning works. It's a very mathematical approach, constantly adjusting to the world by updating this internal mathematical structure, right? And it's the idea of ways that we can connect beliefs and senses to our hypothetical predictions, right? Given this, what's the possible outcome? That. Don't worry about it. This is all like very interesting stuff, and they all connect to each other in different ways. You can totally take a Bayesian approach to understanding the way one neurological population works without, having to say that's literally how all of psychology works, right? This is just a lens. It's a mathematical lens you can apply to say, what's going on in there? And again, this is just the overview. You don't have to memorize all this stuff. And one more. The dynamical systems approaches. Now these are gaining a lot of popularity. This kind of approach takes the concept of behavior and cognition, and they say it sort of emerges naturally from the complexities of the system as a whole, right? The environment in which you interact, your interactions with that environment, the tasks in that environment. It's very mathematical. It borrows heavily from physics, from things like dynamical systems such as the way the solar system moves, right? All the different constraints of one planet operating on another planet, operating on its satellites, on all these things, right? You can formulate questions about the ways that people behave in the world, and anything cognitive behaves in the world, based on ideas about those same kinds of constraints. What's happening in the world? What's happening to my body? What's happening inside my brain? What are my constraints? That helps us to understand what our basic operations are. So these are sometimes criticized for lacking or perhaps avoiding explanations of mind and consciousness and things like that. There's sort of a behaviorist flavor here, but the fact is it's a much stronger and more deeply mathematical explanation of what's happening. So I hope I haven't scared you off. These last few slides have just been a way to highlight that there is not one way that is correct to analyze something as complicated as our brains, our minds, and our consciousness. There's a variety of ways to look at things, and these will come back a bit. We will cover some of them in more detail. Some of them we'll probably leave off on the cutting room floor, but the idea is that these all overlap, and they're all aiming at this one super complex thing, the brain. And that's why this is hoping to show you that's why this is an inherently interdisciplinary field. Some would argue, and I'm among them, that this diversity of approaches and conceptualizations and sort of all these different sort of mathy, biologically, computationally, all these different ways are necessary and healthy for the progression of the field. Pluralism is what that is called for a science. And this should be encouraged. There is not one way, because there's no one way to look at the question of what it is to be conscious, the concept of a mind, how complex the brain is. It's because of that complexity that we need these different ways of looking at things and not having one solidified, oh, here's the rote answers that you can just write down and walk away with, you know? So, yeah. That's the idea. This is a super complicated space. It's sort of a complex field, and all because we're messing around with a very complex thing. And I think that's pretty fun. So, let's touch on basics of the course assessments. As we talked about, there are quizzes for each lecture that you will see on Blackboard. There are assignments. So the majority of the assignments will take a similar form. The idea is it's a research assignment. So you'll take a prompt, likely from a lecture that has happened recently, and you will find you will go and find a science or philosophy article about that prompt. You will summarize it, and you'll give a reaction or response to it in paper form. Short paper, not terribly long. The idea is just to get you thinking about these things and potentially discussing them. So on top of that, we'll have a final exam, which will be a host of questions from the quizzes, right? Just things to jog your memory and remind you of the course content. But also a few short essays to highlight your comprehension, similar to the assignments, right? Just to pull apart what you've taken away from the course. So that's the overview. That's the course as it sits. We're going to climb the cognitive mountain. We're going to rise from the details of the brain up through the complexities of the mind into the sort of squishy, tricky place of the questions of consciousness. So, circling back to that very first question, what are you? This course is trying to break this down into some more detailed, more targeted questions, like, what are you made of? What are you capable of? And what makes you yourself? So, I like to leave with a final thought, something to sort of mull over, maybe prompt some curiosity from you. What was the very first question you ever had that made you question the nature of your brain, your mind, or your conscious experience of the world? All right, that's it. Thanks much. Take care.